An 8-year-old girl living on the streets used to watch from afar a kind millionaire who always helped her with food and little gifts. One day, worried because he didn't show up in the garden as usual, she trespassed onto the property by climbing the mansion's high walls. What she discovered froze her in terror. The man who had always cared for her was partially buried in the garden's soil, weak and desperate, ignoring his pleas for her to run away. She started digging with her small hands to save him. When she finally freed him, he made a revelation that changed everything. The silence was the first thing that was wrong. For 8-year-old Lena, whose life unfolded to the predictable rhythms of the street, the silence of that afternoon was louder than any noise. It was 4 o'clock, the late afternoon sun painting the sky in a soft orange hue, and the man from the mansion should have been in his garden. Every day, right on time, he would appear. A man with graying hair and broad shoulders who moved with a calm that seemed to belong to another world. He tended to his roses with a delicacy Lena had never seen in any other adult, and every day he would leave something on the white marble bench. Sometimes a glossy red apple, other times a still warm roll wrapped in a linen napkin. He never looked at her directly, never called out to her. He just left the gift and went back inside. A tacit agreement of kindness that had become the cornerstone of Lena's fragile existence. But today, the bench was empty. The garden, impeccable as always, was deserted. Hidden behind a thicket of gardenias across the street, Lena felt a knot form in her throat. Distrust, her constant companion since her grandmother was gone, whispered in her ear. Adults disappeared. Adults promised with their eyes and then broke the promise with their absence. Her grandmother, the only person who had truly loved her, had promised to come back from the hospital, but she never did. Since then, Lena had learned not to get attached, not to expect anything from anyone. Yet, this man was different. He asked for nothing in return, didn't look at her with pity or disdain. He simply saw her, and in her world of invisibility, being seen was like a hug for the soul. Worry, an emotion she tried to suppress with all her might, began to bubble up. Stronger than fear, something was terribly wrong. His routine was sacred, as certain as the sunrise. Her heart began to beat faster, a runaway drum in her small chest. She waited another 10 minutes, then 20. The sun began to dip below the horizon, and the shadows stretched like dark fingers over the high stone wall that protected the mansion. She couldn't just leave. The image of the man's kind face, smiling at a yellow rose the week before, flooded her mind. He was the only light in her grey life. Moved by an impulse that was part intuition, part desperation, she made a decision. She rounded the block to a spot where old ivy covered the wall, offering small footholds for her bare feet. Never before had she dared to invade that sanctuary. It was a sacred boundary between their two worlds. But today, the fear that something had happened to him was greater than the fear of being caught. With the determination that defined her, she began to climb. The stones were rough, scraping the skin on her knees and hands, but she didn't feel the pain. Her thin muscles protested, but she kept going, higher and higher, her heart hammering against her ribs. Finally, her fingers gripped the top of the wall. With one last effort, she pulled herself up, crouching on the cold stone, breathless. Below, the garden was even more beautiful up close. A carpet of perfectly manicured grass, beds of colorful flowers, and a fountain of angels that trickled water softly. Her eyes scanned the grounds, searching for him, and then she saw him. Near an ancient oak tree, the earth was disturbed. In the middle of the dark soil, something stood out. The glint of a leather shoe, the cuff of a light linen pant leg, and a little farther on, a pale hand, fingers half open, as if reaching for the sky. Her entire body froze, a scream trapped in her throat. The kind man, her silent angel, was partially buried in his own garden. For a long second, Lena's world fell apart. The soft sound of the fountain seemed like a roar in her ears, and the vibrant colors of the flowers blurred into meaningless splotches. The image of that pale hand, outstretched in the dark earth, was seared into her mind like a branding iron. A chill ran down her spine, the kind of cold she knew well, the cold of abandonment, of irrevocable loss. Not again, please, not again. That thought was the spark that jolted her from her paralysis. Fear gave way to a protective fury, a wave of adrenaline that set her veins on fire. She wasn't going to just stand there. She wasn't going to lose him. Sliding down the wall with an agility born of desperation, she landed on the soft grass, her bare feet barely feeling the impact. Her first thought was to scream for help, to run to the street and flag down the first car. But the street was deserted, and the mansion, with its high walls, seemed to swallow every sound. Her instincts led her to the large iron gates at the front of the property. She shoved them with all her might, her small body crashing against the cold, ornate metal. Nothing. They were locked, sealed by a modern electronic lock that blinked a small green light, mocking her useless effort. She gripped the bars, her face pressed against the iron, and screamed, "Help! Somebody help me!" Her voice was thin, almost a whisper against the silent immensity of the street. No one answered. Panic began to set in, an icy vine twisting around her heart. She was trapped inside, trapped with the man who was dying. The loneliness of the situation hit her full force. There was no one to run to. As always, she was on her own, but this time, someone else's life depended on her. With tears of frustration burning in her eyes, she turned from the gate and began to run along the inner perimeter of the wall, her small hands beating against the solid stone in a desperate rhythm. There had to be another way out, a service door, a secret passage, anything. She scanned every inch of the property, her heart racing. Behind a row of jasmine bushes near the back of the house, she saw it. Not a door, but a flaw in the metal fence that stood behind the ornamental hedge. A narrow, almost unnoticeable opening, where perhaps a small animal could pass. It was her only chance. Without hesitation, she pushed through the thorny bushes, branches scratching her arms and tearing her old t-shirt. The opening was even smaller than it looked. She got on her stomach in the damp earth and began to squirm, pushing herself forward with her toes. The pain was sharp. Rusted metal from the fence tore at the skin on her shoulders and legs, leaving trickles of blood that mixed with the dirt. Every inch gained was an agony, but the image of that pale hand drove her on. She couldn't give up. He hadn't given up on her, leaving food every day without expecting anything in return. Finally, with a last effort that stole her breath, she squeezed through. Staggering to her feet on the other side, she was filthy, bruised, and exhausted, but she was free. Yet, freedom wasn't the goal. She glanced at the empty street for a moment, the temptation to run and forget all of it immense. But then she turned and looked back at the mansion, at the garden where he lay. With a new surge of determination, she found the ivy again and scaled the wall back inside. Now that she knew she could get out, she would not abandon him. She ran back to the oak tree, her heart in her throat. She knelt beside him, fear and hope waging a war in her chest. "Mister," she whispered, her voice trembling. She touched his hand. It was cold. Desperate, she shook it gently. "Mister, please." Suddenly, under her touch, his fingers twitched. His eyes, a deep blue, fluttered open, cloudy and unfocused. His lips moved, and a hoarse sound escaped. He was alive. He looked at her, and a flicker of recognition seemed to clear his confusion. "You!" he rasped, his voice as faint as rustling leaves. "Run, girl. Run before they come back. Run!" The word echoed in Lena's mind, an order laden with panic. It was what she always did. When the older street kids tried to steal her bread, she ran. When security guards shooed her from awnings, she ran. Running was survival, but looking at the man's pale face, at the vulnerability in his blue eyes, a new, stubborn emotion took root in her chest. It was the same feeling she got when she saw a bird with a broken wing or a starving stray cat. Compassion, a force that compelled her to stay, to fight, to protect. She shook her head, not at him, but at the voice of fear inside her. "No," she whispered, the word a solemn vow in the quiet garden. She would not abandon him. He was the only person in the world who treated her like she mattered, and now it was her turn. Without a second thought, she knelt in the damp earth and began to dig. Her small, nimble hands, accustomed to scavenging and squeezing through tight spaces, became rescue tools. The earth was packed down, cold and heavy. Her thin fingernails split almost immediately, the sharp pain, a reminder of her fragility. But she ignored it. With a ferocity born of desperation, she clawed away handfuls of dirt, flinging them aside. Every movement was a monumental effort. Her arms began to burn, her muscles screaming in protest against the brutal work. Sweat dripped down her forehead, mixing with the grime on her face. She was panting, but she didn't stop. She had to free his chest so he could breathe properly. The earth seemed endless, a brown monster slowly swallowing him. The man, whose name she didn't even know, watched her with a mixture of astonishment and anguish. "Stop, little one," he murmured, his voice a wisp. "You'll get hurt. They're dangerous." But his words only made her dig harder. Danger was the air she breathed. She knew hunger, cold, indifference. This was different. This was a battle worth fighting. Tears of frustration and exertion welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away. This was not the time to cry. Seeing she wouldn't give up, he fell silent for a moment, gathering his strength. When he spoke again, his voice was clearer, tinged with a tenderness that made her pause. "And I always knew you were there," he said, his eyes locked on hers, watching from across the street. "I saw you every day." Lena's heart leaped. She had always thought she was invisible, a shadow no one noticed. But he saw her. He noticed. I was waiting," he continued, with difficulty. "Waiting for the right time to really help you, to get you out of that life." The revelation hit her like a wave, washing away some of the fear and distrust that shielded her. He wasn't just being kind out of pity. He had a plan. He cared. That truth gave her renewed strength. The pain in her hands vanished, replaced by an unshakable determination. She wasn't just saving an anonymous benefactor, she was saving the only person who had seen a future for her. With a cry of effort, she managed to clear the earth pressing on his chest. He took a ragged, deep breath, a harsh and painful sound, but it was the sound of life. She kept digging, freeing his shoulders, her focus absolute. The sun had now set, and darkness was beginning to swallow the garden. She had to get him out of there, get him inside the house, to safety. But as she struggled to pull one of his arms free, a sharp sound cut through the evening silence. A metallic click coming from the mansion's back door. Someone was inside the house. The sound of the metallic click froze the blood in Lena's veins. Her entire body went rigid, the air trapped in her lungs. "They're back," the man whispered, the terror in his voice palpable. The adrenaline that had fueled her furious digging turned into a pure, paralyzing fear. She crouched instinctively, trying to make herself as small a target as possible, her gaze fixed on the back door, now a dark silhouette against the faint lights flickering on inside the house. The garden, once a sanctuary of beauty and peace, now felt like a trap, with shadows that moved and whispered threats. For a moment, all she wanted was to run, to scale the wall and disappear into the night, as she had always done. But the man's gaze held her in place. In it, she saw not just fear for himself, but an overwhelming fear for her. And that changed everything. "We have to go now," she whispered back, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The urgency of the situation overrode the panic. With a combined effort, she helped him sit up. He groaned in pain, his body weak and trembling. It was clear the ordeal had left him at the edge of his strength. Leaning on her was almost impossible. She was too small, and he, a tall, strong man, was now completely dependent on the strength of a child. "Use the oak tree," she instructed, her mind working fast. "Lean on it to get up." Using the tree as a lever, he managed to get to his feet, swaying dangerously. Lena put herself under his arm, using her small body as a makeshift crutch. Every step was an agony. He dragged himself along, the dead weight of his legs a terrible burden. The path to the house seemed like a marathon. Lights moved inside, shadows passing by the windows. They didn't have much time. "To the greenhouse," he gasped, pointing to a glass and iron structure hidden behind a row of cypress trees. And it's the only place they wouldn't check. It was far, on the other side of the garden, but it was their only chance. They moved slowly, hiding behind bushes and statues. Lena's heart beating so loudly she feared the sound would give them away. With every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, they froze, waiting to be discovered. Finally, they reached the greenhouse door. The brass handle was cold under Lena's hand. She turned it slowly, praying it wouldn't make a sound. The door opened with a low groan, and they slipped inside, closing it carefully behind them. The air within was warm and humid, thick with the sweet smell of soil and orchids. They hid behind large pots of ferns, crouching on the stone floor. Outside, a door opened. Two male figures stepped out into the garden. They didn't seem alarmed. Their movements were calm, almost casual. One of them lit a cigarette, the orange tip glowing in the dark. "Nothing," one of them said, his voice floating into the greenhouse. "The ground is just how we left it. He must be—" The man didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Lena felt the man beside her tremble, not from cold, but from rage and betrayal. She placed a hand on his arm, an instinctive gesture of comfort. The second man laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Perfect. Tomorrow, Arthur Varela will be officially declared missing, and then Ricardo's plan goes into motion." Ricardo. The name hung in the air. Arthur looked at Lena, and understanding hit them both at the same time. It was his accountant, the man he trusted most. The men went back inside, and the door closed. Arthur and Lena remained in silence for a long time, the weight of that revelation crushing. Safe for the moment, Arthur quietly guided her into the house through a small service door connected to the greenhouse. The mansion was eerily quiet. He led her to the kitchen, where he got a glass of water with trembling hands. Then they went to the living room, to the telephone on a mahogany table. Arthur picked up the receiver, relief visible on his face. But as he lifted it to his ear, his expression changed. He dialed a number, then another. Nothing. He tapped the receiver hook several times, his frustration mounting. "It's dead," he said, his voice filled with a new layer of despair. "They cut the line." He pulled his cell phone from his pocket. The screen was black, lifeless. "They've sabotaged everything." They were completely cut off, trapped in their own home, with the enemy knowing exactly where they were. And worse, the enemy thought he was already out of the way. What would they do when they discovered their plan had failed? The realization that they were isolated hung in the lavish room like a dense fog. Arthur Varela, the man who commanded a financial empire with a simple phone call, was now powerless, his technology silenced by betrayal. He looked around his own home, a place that had always represented safety and power, and saw it with new eyes. The walls seemed to close in, the dark windows like empty eyes watching them. The betrayal by Ricardo, his longtime accountant and friend, was a deep wound, more painful than any physical cut. Ricardo didn't just know his finances, he knew his life, his routines, his vulnerabilities, and he had used it all to orchestrate his ruin. The plan was diabolical in its simplicity. Bury him in his own garden, leave him for dead, and then calmly file a missing persons report and plunder his fortune. Lena watched Arthur, seeing the internal struggle on his face. The initial shock was giving way to a cold, calculating anger. She, who had lived her entire life on high alert, recognized that look. It was the look of someone who had been pushed to the edge and had decided to fight back. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice low but firm. The simple question seemed to anchor Arthur, pulling him out of his swirling thoughts. He looked down at the girl, streaked with dirt and dried blood, her large, serious eyes fixed on him. Her courage was a beacon in the darkness of his situation. She had saved him, risking everything for a stranger. He owed her more than his life. He owed her safety, a future. "First," he said, his voice regaining some of its usual authority, "we're going to take care of those cuts." He led her to a luxurious bathroom with gold-plated faucets and plush towels. For the first time in her life, Lena saw herself in such a large, clean mirror. The girl staring back was a stranger, her face smudged and her hair tangled. Arthur cleaned her scrapes with a fatherly gentleness that unnerved her, the soft touch, an almost forgotten sensation. As he tended to her, his mind worked furiously. Ricardo wasn't a criminal mastermind. He was meticulous. Yes, but not bold. This wasn't his style. "This is bigger than just Ricardo," Arthur said, more to himself than to Lena. "But he wouldn't have the nerve to do this alone. He's a pawn, an enforcer." The idea began to take shape in his mind. Ricardo managed the finances for several other wealthy business owners in the area. What if he wasn't the only target? What if this was a larger scheme, a corrupt network that used Ricardo's expertise to identify and exploit vulnerabilities? It was a theory, but it made sense. The plan was too sophisticated for Ricardo's limited imagination. The forged documents, the sabotage of the security systems, the perfect timing, it all pointed to a well-coordinated operation. "We need proof," he murmured. "Proof that this isn't just about me." He remembered a casual conversation with a colleague weeks ago about irregularities in his accounts, small discrepancies that his own accountant, also recommended by Ricardo, had dismissed as clerical errors. At the time, Arthur had thought nothing of it. Now, the memory haunted him. Lena, perched on the edge of the marble bathtub, listened intently. While she didn't understand the financial details, she understood patterns. She understood that predators rarely strike just once. "Are they coming back?" she asked, bringing the immediate threat back into focus. Arthur nodded gravely. "Yes. When they realize they can't access the accounts, they'll come to check. They'll want to make sure the problem has been dealt with. They had to get out of there before dawn, but where could they go? The police were the obvious choice, but something made him hesitate. If the scheme was this big, how high up did the corruption go? He couldn't risk it. His mind turned to the office, Ricardo's office. That's where the proof would be. Contracts, transaction records, maybe even communications that would expose the others involved. It was a huge risk, but it was the only path he could see. "Lena," he said, kneeling to meet her gaze, "I need to ask you for one more thing, something very dangerous." Before he could finish, a noise from outside made them both freeze. The unmistakable sound of a car engine pulling up in front of the mansion, the sound of a car door shutting. They weren't alone. The sound of the car stopping out front was like a fire alarm in the dead of night. Arthur and Lena looked at each other, the same fear mirrored in their eyes. There was no time to think, only to react. Arthur grabbed her hand, the instinct to protect overriding his own physical weakness, and pulled her out of the bathroom. "Quick, to the library," he whispered, his voice tense. He knew every inch of this house, every creaky floorboard, every secret passage his eccentric grandfather had built decades ago. The library was his fortress, A maze of towering bookshelves and shadowy alcoves with a discreet exit leading to a forgotten inner courtyard. They moved like shadows through the dark hallways, Lena's bare feet making no sound on the polished hardwood floors. The sound of a key turning in the front door lock echoed through the house, magnified by the silence. They hurried, Lena's heart hammering against her ribs. They reached the library and Arthur closed the heavy oak doors behind them, not locking them so as not to make a sound. The room was dark, lit only by the silver moonlight filtering through the tall windows. The smell of old leather and paper filled the air. "Here," Arthur said, guiding her to a bookshelf in the far corner. He pressed a section of the wood ornamentation, and a part of the bookshelf groaned inward, revealing a narrow, dusty passage. It was a tight squeeze, barely enough room for both of them, but it was safe. As soon as they were inside, Arthur closed the passage, plunging them into total darkness. On the other side of the wall, they heard the library doors swing open. Two male voices, the same they'd heard in the garden, entered the room. Lena held her breath, her body trembling uncontrollably. Arthur wrapped an arm around her, a comforting gesture that anchored her in the dark. "You sure this is the spot?" one of the voices asked. It was the rougher, more impatient one. Ricardo said Varela kept a safe in here, behind one of the paintings. There was the sound of paintings being lifted from the wall, thudding against the floor. "I'm not finding anything," the second voice said, frustrated. "Maybe Ricardo was wrong." "Ricardo is never wrong when it comes to money," the first one replied. "He's been watching everything. He even knows about the street kid the old softy was feeding." Lena's heart stopped. They knew about her. How could they know? She was a shadow, a nobody. Fear turned into an icy terror. She was no longer an accidental bystander. She was part of their plan. "He said she could be useful," the voice continued. "A perfect witness, if need be. A street kid who saw the millionaire skip town with a suitcase full of cash. No one would believe her if she said otherwise. Or, if things get complicated, we can use her to apply some pressure." In the cramped darkness, Arthur felt Lena stiffen. The cruelty of the plan was breathtaking. They didn't just plan to rob him and leave him for dead. They planned to destroy an innocent child's life in the process. Rage consumed him, a white-hot, silent fury. He had to protect this girl at all costs. "Forget the safe for now," the first voice said after a moment. "Let's check the garden again, just to be sure. If he's not there, the plan proceeds as scheduled." They left the library, and the silence returned. Arthur and Lena waited, counting every torturous second. Only when they heard the front door close and the car drive away did Arthur open the secret passage. The moonlight found them pale and shaken. The threat was no longer abstract. They had a face, a plan, and Lena was right at the center of it. There was nowhere left to run. Going to the police now seemed an even riskier gamble. They exited the mansion through the library passage, emerging into a small, ivy-covered courtyard. From there, a small iron gate, rusted from disuse, led them to an alley behind the property. They were free, but the world outside now seemed more dangerous than the besieged house. Arthur was still weak, and Lena knew the dangers of the city at night all too well. "We need a safe place," Arthur said, his mind racing. "Somewhere no one would think to look for us." But before they could take the first step away from the mansion, Arthur stumbled, the exhaustion and pain finally overwhelming him. He leaned against the alley wall, gasping for breath. I can't go much further," he admitted, defeat in his voice. They were exposed, vulnerable, and the only adult capable of protecting them was at the end of his strength. For the first time, Lena realized the roles had reversed. Now she was the one who had to lead. She was the one who had to find a path through the darkness, not just for herself, but for them both. Arthur's vulnerability in the dark alley was a shock to Lena. She was used to seeing him as a strong, unshakable figure, the man who tended his roses with steady, gentle hands. To see him now, pale and breathless, leaning against the cold brick wall, turned her world upside down. The fear was still there, a tight knot in her stomach, but something stronger emerged: responsibility. Her whole life, she had been the one protected, first by her grandmother, then, in a way, by him. Now, the roles were reversed. She had to be the strong one. "I know a place," she said, her voice surprisingly calm. "It's not far. Can you walk a little more?" He nodded, the gratitude in his eyes giving her a courage she didn't know she possessed. She led him through the back streets and alleyways that were her domain, a map etched into her memory by necessity. It was a world Arthur Varela, the millionaire, had never seen. The smell of damp garbage, the sound of distant sirens, the shadows that moved with a life of their own. Lena's place was an abandoned movie palace, a husk of former glory. A broken window in the back was her front door. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of dust and decay. The main stage was her bedroom, a pile of old red velvet curtains her bed. She helped him lie down on the soft, dusty fabric. He fell asleep almost instantly, exhaustion pulling him into unconsciousness. Lena stood watch, sitting on the edge of the stage, observing him as he slept. The theater's decaying grandeur seemed to mirror their situation. A powerful man, stripped of everything, taking refuge in the humblest of places. For the first time, she felt a genuine connection to him, not of gratitude, but of camaraderie. They were two castaways in the same storm. At dawn, Arthur awoke, feeling slightly stronger. The first order of business was the police. Despite his misgivings, it was the proper procedure. They found the nearest precinct, a grey, imposing building. Lena felt her old fear of uniforms and authority return, but Arthur's steady hand on her shoulder kept her calm. Inside, they were met with skepticism. A millionaire claiming to have been buried alive by his accountant, accompanied by a street kid as his only witness. The story sounded like a delusion. The officer at the desk, a burly man with a bored expression, barely looked up from his paperwork. "Mr. Varela, we have a file here that your companies are under investigation for fraud," the officer said with a sharp coldness. Arthur was stunned. "That's impossible. It's a lie. And you, kid," the officer turned to Lena, "we've had reports of you loitering around Mr. Varela's property. Maybe you're in on this for a cut." The accusations were absurd, poisonous. Lena felt the floor drop out from under her. They weren't there to help. They were there to accuse. They were on Ricardo's side. The realization was a punch to the gut. The scheme ran deeper than they'd imagined. The corruption had seeped into the police force. They left the precinct in a daze. Hope turned to ash. They were utterly alone. As they walked aimlessly, Lena's mind worked, connecting the dots. The men in the library, they knew about her. They said she could be useful. The visit to the police, the ready-made accusations. It wasn't random. It was planned. Suddenly, a memory hit her with the force of a lightning strike. A week ago, a man in a suit had approached her on the street. He seemed kind. He offered her a sandwich and asked questions. Where did she sleep? Did she know the man in the mansion? Was he good to her? At the time, she'd been wary and given vague answers, but his kindness had disarmed her. Now, the image of the man's face became crystal clear in her mind. It was Ricardo. He hadn't just stumbled upon her. He had been studying her, watching her just as she had been watching Arthur. The discovery left her breathless. Her luck in finding Arthur hadn't been luck. Her presence there, at that moment, was no coincidence. She had been manipulated, a piece moved on a cruel chessboard. The plan had never been just about robbing Arthur. From the very beginning, the plan was to use her to frame him. The revelation landed on Lena like a concrete slab. The air seemed to grow thick, hard to breathe. Every act of kindness she thought she'd received from Arthur, every warm roll, every shiny apple, now felt tainted, twisted into bait in a cruel trap. Ricardo hadn't discovered her. He had selected her. She wasn't an accidental savior. She was a premeditated scapegoat. The realization made her feel dirty, used. The deep-seated distrust of adults, which she had tried so hard to overcome because of Arthur, came roaring back, sharper and more painful than ever. She looked at Arthur, who was watching her with concern, seeing the change in her expression. For a terrible moment, a poisonous doubt entered her mind. What if Arthur was part of it too? What if this was all some elaborate game? She crushed the thought the instant it was born, the terror in his eyes when he was buried, his vulnerability in the alley, his helpless rage at the precinct. None of that could have been faked. He was as much a victim as she was. "He talked to me," she said, her voice a thread. "A week ago, Ricardo. He gave me food and asked about you." The confession came out in a guilty stumble. "I didn't know. I thought he was just another nosy adult." Arthur listened, and the look on his face shifted from confusion to a dark understanding. The true cruelty of Ricardo's plan unfolded before him. This wasn't just a financial crime, it was the psychological manipulation of a vulnerable child. Using her compassion and loyalty against them both was a level of evil he could barely comprehend. "This wasn't your fault, Lena," he said, his voice filled with a fierce conviction. He knelt on the sidewalk, ignoring the stares of passers-by. "You did nothing wrong. He's the monster here, not you. He took advantage of your kindness." His words were a balm on the open wound in her soul, but the guilt lingered. If she had been smarter, more suspicious, maybe none of this would have happened. The realization that they were being hunted and could trust no one forced them deep into the shadows. The abandoned theater, once a refuge, now felt too exposed. They needed to disappear completely. For Arthur, it was a brutal lesson in humility. He, who was accustomed to luxury suites and private drivers, now learned from Lena how to move through the city like a ghost. She taught him how to avoid security cameras, how to walk the streets as if he didn't want to be seen, how to find shelter in the places society preferred to ignore. They slept in crowded overnight shelters, where the smell of disinfectant and desperation mingled. They ate at soup kitchens, standing in lines with people whose stories of loss and hardship were etched on their faces. For Lena, it was normal. For Arthur, it was a revelation. He saw, for the first time, the world through her eyes, a world of invisibility, where the struggle for survival overshadowed everything else. The role reversal deepened the bond between them. He was no longer the millionaire benefactor, and she was no longer the needy street girl. They were partners, equals in their struggle. He told her about his past, about the loneliness of growing up with wealth, about the wife he had lost years ago. She, for the first time since her grandmother's death, spoke of her own losses, her fears, and her simple dream of having a place to call home. In the whispered conversations, in the darkness of their hiding spots, they built a makeshift family, forged in the fires of adversity. But the threat still loomed. One day, while using a computer at a public library to check the news, they saw it. A small note in the business section. Local tycoon Jorge Mireles vanishes on business trip. Jorge Mireles. Arthur knew him. He was one of his colleagues, a man whose accounting was also handled by Ricardo. The air grew heavy. It wasn't just about them. The scheme was bigger and deadlier than they had imagined. Jorge didn't have a Lena to dig him out. The news of Jorge Mireles' disappearance changed the dynamic of their fight. It was no longer just about personal survival. It became a race against time to stop more people from becoming victims. The name on the computer screen wasn't just a headline to Arthur. It was the face of a friend, a man with a family and a life built on hard work. Guilt gnawed at him. If he had paid more attention to the small irregularities, If he had questioned Ricardo more deeply, perhaps Jorge would still be safe. The responsibility weighed on his shoulders, not just for Lena, but for all the other potential victims of this corrupt network. They couldn't hide anymore. They had to act. "We have to warn the others," Arthur said, his voice low and urgent. "There's a list of clients Ricardo handled. I have it memorized. We need to contact them before it's too late." But how? With no phones, no money, no ID. They were ghosts. Any attempt at direct contact could expose them and alert Ricardo and his accomplices. Lena, watching the turmoil of emotions on Arthur's face, felt a wave of empathy. She knew that feeling of helplessness, the desperate will to help and the frustration of having no means. But her life on the streets had taught her to think differently, to find solutions where others saw only dead ends. "Libraries," she said simply. "They have payphones and computers. We can create a fake email, send anonymous messages." The simplicity of the idea was brilliant. They spent the next few days moving from one public library to another, in different parts of the city to avoid creating a pattern. Arthur, using his knowledge of his colleagues' businesses, drafted coded emails, warning them of a security breach in their financial systems and advising them to freeze their accounts and seek independent auditors, without mentioning Ricardo's name directly. It was a long shot. They didn't know if the messages would be taken seriously or dismissed as spam. While Arthur focused on the strategy, Lena became his eyes and ears. She used her invisibility to her advantage, moving through the streets, watching, listening. Near Ricardo's old office building, she would sit on a park bench, pretending to read a tattered book she'd found and watch the comings and goings. She saw men in suits entering and leaving, their faces tense, their conversations hurried. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the body language of anxiety and conspiracy. One afternoon, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Ricardo came out of the building, accompanied by one of the officers from the precinct, the same one who had treated them with such disdain. They weren't arguing, they were laughing, walking side by side like old friends. The proof of corruption was right there in front of her. The network was real and powerful. The hardship of their situation deepened with each passing day. The little cash Arthur had in his pocket ran out. Hunger became a constant companion. The nights grew colder, and the weariness began to take a toll on their bodies. On one particularly cold night, huddled under a bridge, Arthur began to cough, a dry, racking cough that shook his frame. The ordeal in the garden and the constant stress were catching up to him. Lena watched him with growing worry, the fear of losing him becoming a physical ache in her chest. She covered him with her own threadbare coat, a small gesture that held all the care she could offer. That night, as he slept fitfully, Lena made a decision. Hiding and sending warnings wasn't enough. They were losing the war. They needed a weapon, proof so undeniable that not even the corrupt police could ignore it. And she knew that proof could only be in one place, inside Ricardo's office. The idea was insane, suicidal, but it was the only one they had left. They had to go back into the heart of enemy territory. The idea of infiltrating Ricardo's office was as terrifying as it was necessary. Arthur, upon waking and hearing Lena's plan, protested immediately. It was too dangerous. She was a child. His first responsibility was to keep her safe, and her plan was the very opposite of that. But Lena was adamant. Her determination, forged on the streets, was made of steel. "You're sick," she argued, her voice soft but unyielding. "We can't keep going like this. They'll find us, or the cold will. We need to end this, and the only way is to get the proof." He knew she was right. His cough was getting worse, and the weakness in his limbs was a constant reminder of his vulnerability. Continuing to hide was just delaying the inevitable. With a heavy heart, he agreed, but on one condition: they would do it together, and they would plan every step with the utmost care. For the next few days, They dedicated themselves to watching the office building, no longer from a distance, but up close, studying the patterns and routines. Lena used her ability to be invisible, sitting near the entrance with a paper cup, looking like just another kid begging for change. No one gave her a second glance. She memorized the security guards, schedules, the frequency of their patrols, the type of lock on the back door, and the locations of the cameras. Arthur, in turn, used his analytical mind to process the information she gathered, drawing crude maps on stolen napkins. He knew the building's layout from his past visits and knew exactly where Ricardo's office was, third floor, end of the hall. The challenge was getting there undetected. The building had 24-hour security, the front doors were impenetrable. The back entrance, however, led to a less monitored service alley. The plan they devised was risky and depended on perfect timing. They would go in on a weekend, a Saturday night, when the building was mostly empty. There was a blind spot in the alley's cameras, near a dumpster. If they could get the service door open in under 10 seconds, they could slip in unseen. The problem was the electronic lock. Arthur remembered that the door was often propped open by cleaning staff stepping out for a smoke break. It was a slim chance, but it was the only one they had. As they finalized the details, a new and terrible discovery shook them. On one of their library visits, Arthur found an alarming discussion on an online investor forum. Someone had posted documents that looked like they were from an adoption agency, but the names and dates were altered. Among them, one document stood out. It was a forged adoption certificate, declaring that Arthur Varela had recently adopted a young girl named Lena. The air rushed out of Arthur's lungs. Ricardo's plan was even more sinister than they had imagined. He wasn't just going to frame Lena as a reluctant accomplice. He was legally making her his daughter. The implication was clear and devastating. Any financial crimes Arthur Varela committed from that point on, any flight or movement of funds, would have Lena as a legal accomplice, an heir entangled in the scheme. If Arthur disappeared, the fortune would pass to her. But as a minor under investigation, her assets would be managed by a court-appointed guardian, a guardian who would undoubtedly be one of Ricardo's cronies. They were boxed in. If they were caught, the story of a street kid helping an innocent man would become the story of an accomplice daughter helping her criminal father flee justice. The narrative was ready, perfectly constructed to destroy them. Now, breaking into the office wasn't just about justice for others. It was about reclaiming their own lives and identities, which were being stolen and rewritten by a man with no scruples. The urgency of their mission became absolute. There was no turning back. The discovery of the forged adoption papers was a devastating blow, but it was also a catalyst. Fear gave way to a cold, focused anger. Ricardo's maneuver wasn't just about money, it was a profound violation of their identities, an attempt to corrupt the bond they had formed and turn it into a weapon. Arthur looked at Lena, whose face was pale in the dim library light, and saw not just the child he needed to protect, but a partner whose courage inspired him. "He's not going to win, Lena," Arthur said, his voice low but vibrating with an intensity she had never heard before. "We're going to take back everything he stole from us." That moment solidified their alliance. They were no longer just reacting, they were fighting back. Saturday night arrived with a cold, fine rain that shrouded the city in a grey veil. It was the perfect cover for their mission, the streets emptier and the sounds muffled by the water. Dressed in dark clothes they'd found in a donation box, they approached the alley behind the office building. Lena's heart was racing, a wild drum against her ribs. This was a different kind of fear than she was used to. It wasn't the passive fear of a victim, but the active fear of a fighter about to enter the ring. Arthur, despite his persistent cough and sickly pallor, moved with a renewed resolve. The injustice done to Lena had awakened a sleeping lion within him. They hid behind the dumpster, in the camera blind spot Lena had identified. The wait was agonizing. Every minute dragged on like an hour. They watched the service door, hoping their long-shot theory was correct. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door opened. A man in a janitor's uniform stepped out to smoke a cigarette, pulling the door shut behind him, but not letting it latch completely. This was their chance. The man stood with his back to the alley, looking out toward the street. "Now," Arthur whispered. They moved in perfect sync. Lena, small and swift, slipped from the shadows and reached the door, catching it before the closing mechanism engaged. Arthur followed, and within seconds, they were inside the building's dark and silent service corridor. The smell of cleaning chemicals and recycled air conditioning filled the air. They were in enemy territory. The building was eerily quiet, the only sounds the low hum of emergency lights and the beat of their own hearts. They took the emergency stairs, avoiding the elevator and its cameras. Each floor they passed ratcheted up the tension. On the third floor, they paused. The hallway was deserted. The door to Ricardo's office was at the far end, a brass plate gleaming faintly. Ricardo Mendez, Financial Consulting. Arthur tried the handle. Locked. He pulled from his pocket a small paperclip Lena had found, a skill she'd learned for picking mailbox locks to get junk mail for warmth. His hands trembled from both fever and nerves, but his mind was sharp. After several tense seconds that felt like a lifetime, they heard a soft click. The door was open. The office was dark, the blinds drawn. Only the glow from computer monitors in sleep mode illuminated the space. They slipped inside, closing the door silently behind them. The targets were Ricardo's main computer and his metal filing cabinet. While Arthur tried to guess the computer's password, cycling through family names and important dates he knew, Lena went to the cabinet. It was locked. She examined the small lock, but she knew a paperclip wouldn't be enough. Disappointed, she turned away, and as she did, her foot bumped against something under the desk. It was a small safe, almost hidden in the shadows. She knelt, and to her astonishment, the safe door was slightly ajar, as if someone had closed it in a hurry. Inside, there was a single file folder. When Lena opened it, her jaw dropped. These weren't financial documents, they were photos. Photos of her, taken from a distance, over a period of weeks, watching the garden, sleeping in the abandoned movie palace, and the most recent, most terrifying one of all, a photo of her and Arthur huddled under the bridge, taken just the day before. They weren't just being hunted, they had been watched the entire time. Every move they made, he knew. Their sense of safety had been an illusion. The office door flew open with a bang. The hallway light flooded the room, silhouetting the figure of Ricardo, the corrupt cop at his side. "I knew you'd come," Ricardo said, a triumphant smirk spreading across his face. "I was just waiting for the right moment." Lena and Arthur's world shrank to the space in that illuminated doorway. Ricardo's smile was the most terrifying thing Lena had ever seen, a mix of triumph and cruelty. The cop beside him had his hand on his holstered gun, his posture relaxed, confident he was in complete control. The trap had been sprung. The office, which was supposed to be the site of their victory, had become the stage for their capture. The silence that followed was heavy, laden with unspoken threats. "Impressive, isn't it?" Ricardo said, strolling into the room and gesturing at the folder in Lena's hands. "I always knew your compassion would be your downfall, Arthur. And this little street rat's determination would be the perfect tool to lure you in." He walked calmly to his desk, settling into his leather chair like a king on his throne. "All this time, you thought you were fighting, hiding, but you were just following my script." Arthur moved protectively in front of Lena, his weak body tensed like a bowstring. His mind raced, searching for an escape, a flaw in Ricardo's perfect plan, but there was none. The windows overlooked a 3-story drop. The only door was blocked. "What do you want, Ricardo?" Arthur asked, his voice hoarse with sickness but steady. You already have everything. The money, the companies. Ricardo let out a bitter laugh. The money is just a means to an end, Arthur. The real prize is power. The power to make people like you, who were born with a silver spoon and never knew a real struggle, get on your knees. The power to rewrite the story. He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Lena and her. She's my masterpiece. The street kid who inherits a fortune and then, tragically, gets into an accident with her fugitive adoptive father. The public will eat it up. And the legal guardian, appointed by my friend here, he gestured to the cop, will ensure the fortune is well managed. The coldness of the plan was inhuman. They weren't people to Ricardo, they were pawns in his game. While Ricardo gloated, Lena's mind, honed by the need to survive, was working at high speed. The fear was still there, a constant hum in her ears, but the anger was stronger. She glanced around the office, her eyes taking in every detail. Arthur's computer was still on the login screen. The folder in her hands was proof they'd been watched. And on Ricardo's desk, next to his elbow, was his cell phone, plugged into its charger. An idea, a spark of insane, desperate hope, began to form. She remembered the days in the library, how Arthur had taught her the basics of technology, how emails could be sent instantly to multiple people. She thought of the contact list Arthur had written on a napkin, still in her pocket. At that moment, Arthur's cough exploded, a violent fit that doubled him over. He staggered, his weakness overwhelming him. The cop took a step forward, ready to subdue him. It was the distraction Lena needed. In a flash, she moved. She didn't run for the door, she didn't scream. She lunged forward, under Ricardo's outstretched arm, and snatched the cell phone from the desk. Ricardo, caught by surprise, tried to grab her, but she was too fast. She scrambled to the other side of the room, putting a chair between herself and them. "Don't come any closer!" she yelled, her voice surprisingly strong. The cop drew his weapon. "Drop the phone, kid!" But Lena's fingers were already flying across the screen. She didn't know the phone's password. But Ricardo's face was right in front of her. With a swift motion, she aimed the front-facing camera at him. The facial recognition technology unlocked the device instantly. Ricardo went pale, realizing his mistake. She opened the email app. With trembling hands, she attached the most recent photo from the gallery, the picture of her and Arthur under the bridge. And in the recipient field, she began typing the first name on Arthur's list. That of an editor at a major investigative newspaper he had mentioned was his last hope. She just needed a few more seconds. The final confrontation wouldn't be with force, but with the speed of her fingers and the courage to press a single button. Time seemed to slow. The click of the cop's gun being cocked echoed in the office, a final, terrible sound. Ricardo rose, his face a mask of fury and panic. "Give me that!" he snarled, lunging toward Lena. But he was a man of numbers and strategies, not quick action. Lena, on the other hand, was a product of survival instinct. She dodged him, using the chair as a shield, her eyes locked on the glowing screen. The journalist's name was typed. Her finger hovered over the send button. In that instant, Arthur, summoning one last ounce of strength, threw himself forward. He didn't go for the armed officer, but tackled Ricardo, sending them both tumbling in a heap of limbs and surprise. The cop, hesitating for a crucial second between shooting the child and helping his accomplice, lost his chance. In that second of chaos, Lena hit send. The word "sending" flashed on the screen, followed by "sent." It was done. The office door burst open, not with more villains, but with a team of uniformed officers from a different division, carrying tactical weapons and wearing bulletproof vests. They were federal agents. "Hands in the air, feds!" the team leader shouted. Ricardo and the corrupt cop froze, the look of shock on their faces almost comical. One of Arthur's anonymous emails had worked. He had reached out not just to businessmen, but to an old friend who worked at a federal agency, giving her just enough fragmented information to launch a quiet investigation. Their presence here, at this exact moment, was the result of weeks of surveillance and the triggering of a silent alarm Arthur had installed on his home computer system, programmed to alert them if anyone tried to access it with admin passwords. Exactly what Ricardo, in his arrogance, had done that night. The scene that followed was a blur to Lena. Ricardo and his accomplice were handcuffed and led away, protesting their innocence in vain. Paramedics rushed in and put Arthur on a stretcher, his consciousness fading in and out. Before he was taken, he reached a hand out to Lena, his eyes full of a pride and love that warmed her to her soul. "You did it," he whispered. "My brave girl." In the commotion, a kind-faced female agent approached Lena. "You're safe now," she said, wrapping a warm blanket around her. For the first time in years, Lena didn't shrink from a stranger's touch. She let herself relax. The exhaustion of weeks of fighting finally catching up to her, the nightmare was over. The following days were a whirlwind of statements, medical checkups, and the strange calm that follows a storm. Lena's email, containing the photo that proved the illegal surveillance, was the final piece of the puzzle for the investigators. Combined with the documents found in Ricardo's office and the testimonies of other alerted businessmen, the case against the criminal network was airtight. Their story made the headlines, not as the twisted narrative Ricardo had planned, but as the truth. That of a betrayed millionaire and the courageous street girl who saved him. Lena, initially terrified at the idea of speaking to authorities, found a new confidence. With Arthur by her side, recovering in a hospital room, she told her story. Her voice, once hesitant, grew clear and strong. She was no longer an invisible victim. She was a witness, a hero. The distrust that had chained her for so long began to dissolve, replaced by a cautious faith in justice and the people who upheld it. The biggest victory came when the forged adoption papers were nullified. But seeing the sadness on Arthur's face at the news, Lena realized something surprising. The idea of being his daughter, which had once felt like a trap, now felt right. In the midst of all the chaos and danger, they had become a real family. The legal victory was important, but the emotional one was what truly mattered. And that battle, she realized, still needed to be fought in their own hearts. 5 weeks after that fateful afternoon, the sun shone brightly over the garden of Arthur Varela's mansion. The roses bloomed in vibrant shades of red, yellow, and pink, their petals like jewels in the morning light. The air was fragrant, not with the smell of disturbed earth and fear, but with the promise of a new beginning. In the center of the lawn, near the old oak tree that had witnessed so much despair, Arthur and Lena stood side by side. He, though still a bit thinner, had his color and strength back. She wore a light blue dress, her hair, now clean and brushed, shining in the sun. They weren't alone. A small crowd was gathered, among them the other victims of Ricardo's scheme and their families, as well as the federal agent who had become their friend. Where there had once been a patch of dark, terrifying earth, there was now a small memorial. A simple bronze plaque set in a smooth stone read, "Where darkness tried to reign, courage bloomed. In honor of all whose trust was betrayed, may their strength inspire justice and compassion." It had been Lena's idea. She didn't want to forget what happened, but she wanted to transform the memory of pain into a symbol of hope. Arthur had recovered his assets and his reputation. The criminal network was dismantled, and Ricardo and his accomplices would face long sentences. Justice had been served. But for Arthur and Lena, the most important resolution happened far from any courtroom. The week before, sitting in the same library where they had once hidden, Arthur had handed her an envelope. Inside was not a forged document, but an official adoption petition, legitimate and filled out in a steady hand. "This isn't about money or an inheritance, Lena," he had said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is about family. If you'll have me, I'd like to be your father, for real." The tears Lena shed then were not of fear or sadness, but of a joy so overwhelming it felt too big for her small body. The fear of abandonment, the ghost that had haunted her all her life, finally began to recede. She had found someone who not only didn't leave her at her worst, but who chose to stay forever. Now, in the garden, as people chatted and shared stories of recovery, Lena felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Arthur. He knelt before her, as he had so many times during their ordeal. "I'll never forget what you did for me, Lena," he said. "You didn't just save my life. You reminded me what really matters." She smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her whole face. "We saved each other," she corrected. It was true. She had saved him from the earth, and he had saved her from invisibility. He, the man who had everything, had learned that true wealth wasn't in his bank accounts, but in the ability to protect and to love. And she, the girl who had nothing, discovered she possessed the most valuable thing of all, an unbreakable courage and a heart capable of trusting again. Later, after the guests had left, father and daughter stood alone in the garden that was now theirs. The sun began to set, painting the sky in the same colors as that afternoon that had changed everything. But now, there was no wrong silence, only the peace of a home found. Lena knew the scars, both the physical ones on her arms and the emotional ones on her soul, would always be there. But they were no longer marks of pain. They were reminders of her strength. The garden, once a place of betrayal, now bloomed as a testament that even from the darkest soil, the most beautiful flowers can grow. The girl who had once watched this world from afar was now standing right in the center of it, not as an intruder, but as the master of her own future. And she knew, with a certainty that warmed her heart, that she would never be alone again.